Laryngeal anatomy that's relevant for speech production includes the hard structures of the larynx, one bone, the hyoid bone, and several cartilages, the main ones being the thyroid, cricoid, and arytenoid cartilages, as well as the epiglottis. There are a couple of important joints for speech functions of the larynx between the cricoid and the arytenoid cartilages, and between the cricoid and the thyroid cartilages. Finally, there are a few important spaces between different folds that create valves in the laryngeal system. The aryepiglottic fold surrounds the entrance to the larynx. The false or ventricular vocal folds are a protective layer just above the vocal folds, and then the vocal folds themselves, which get used in phonation. The larynx is situated between the pharynx and the trachea. The hyoid bone is a U-shaped bone that provides a superior support structure for the larynx, located basically right at the bend of the neck. The thyroid cartilage is a V-shaped cartilage that provides anterior protection for the larynx and an attachment point for the vocal folds. And the cricoid cartilage is the base of the larynx. It has a tall posterior lamina and a narrow anterior arch to fit the thyroid cartilage in front of it. The thyroid cartilage has two front plates known as lamina. These lamina meet at the angle, and there is a notch that is the superior part of that meeting point. There are superior horns from the thyroid cartilage that extend toward the hyoid bone and are connected to it by ligaments. There are also inferior horns that extend and articulate with the cricoid cartilage. The arytenoid cartilages sit on top of the cricoid lamina, and they provide posterior attachment points for the vocal folds. Connections from the hyoid bone to the thyroid cartilage include the lateral thyrohyoid ligaments on the sides, the medial hyothyroid ligament in the middle, and the space in between filled by the thyrohyoid membrane. The description of these elements varies a little bit in the order of hyo versus thyro, and even within this same textbook, they are sometimes listed one way and sometimes listed the other way. Between the thyroid and the cricoid cartilage, there is also a medial ligament that connects from the arch of the cricoid to the inferior part of the angle of the thyroid, and the space in between is filled by the cricothyroid membrane. From the cricoid to the trachea, the space is filled by a cricotracheal membrane. So there are a few minor parts, but their names are relatively straightforward. The cricoid cartilage articulates with the arytenoid cartilages and with the thyroid cartilage. Each of these points of articulation is called a facet. The arytenoid cartilages have a lateral muscular process that's an attachment point for many of the intrinsic muscles of the larynx that will help move the arytenoid cartilages and control the location of the vocal folds. There is an anterior vocal process on the arytenoid cartilage that provides the attachment point for the vocal fold that sticks out into the open space defined by the ring of the cricoid cartilage, which is where the vocal folds and the glottis will be. The epiglottis rests at the posterior root of the tongue. It has an anterior attachment to the thyroid cartilage at the angle of the thyroid just below the notch. It has a posterior attachment to the arytenoid cartilages via the aryepiglottic fold. The connections from the epiglottis to the tongue form two spaces called the valleculae. These spaces are between a middle glossoepiglottic fold and two lateral glossoepiglottic folds, and this will be an important channel for swallowing, but not so relevant for speech. The joints between these skeletal structures include the articulation between the cricoid and the arytenoid, the base of the arytenoid cartilage, if you think of it kind of like a pyramid shape. The bottom part of that pyramid shape sits on the thicker lamina part of the cricoid cartilage, posterior in the body. This joint allows the arytenoid cartilages to both slide along the body of the cricoid cartilage as well as to rotate. And we'll discuss the muscles that make the various actions shown in the left side of the image surrounded by blue and their connections to the vocal folds in a separate lecture. Due to these movements of the arytenoid cartilages, the vocal process that connects to the vocal folds results in a control of the position of the vocal folds over that airway that runs from the trachea up through the cricoid, past the thyroid. We refer to this space between the vocal folds as the glottis. The cricoid and the thyroid also have an articulation where the inferior horns of the thyroid rest on facets of the cricoid near the base of the lamina. This allows the thyroid cartilage to pivot in an anterior-posterior direction with contraction of muscles between the cricoid and the thyroid. Given that the vocal folds attach to the thyroid cartilage anteriorly, this movement will have an effect on the length of the vocal folds. The various folds and the spaces between them make 3 different valves through the larynx. The aryepiglottic fold from the arytenoid cartilage up to the epiglottis surrounds the entry to the larynx, makes part of the ring around the entry to the larynx. There is an aryepiglottic muscle under the fold that can move the epiglottis to cover the larynx when swallowing to provide a protective function. The false or ventricular vocal folds are a set of folds just above the true vocal folds that can close to protect the airway or to support thoracic fixation, which is to hold air inside the lungs and not let it escape to provide a more stable base for heavy exertion like weightlifting. It can be the case that the false vocal folds pathologically interfere with speech production in cases of excess laryngeal tension. The vocal folds themselves, which we'll go into in more detail, can be adducted, brought together in order to close off that space between them, the glottis, as indicated in the upper image. The vocal folds have 5 different layers. At the surface is an elastic epithelial layer. There are 3 different connective tissue layers called the superficial, intermediate, and deep lamina propria that vary in their elasticity. And then at the base, there is a part of the thyroarytenoid muscle, sometimes referred to as the vocalis. The outer 2 layers of the vocal folds are relatively disorganized and sometimes referred to together as the mucosa. The middle 2 layers are more anterior-posterior organized, so the connective fibers run from front to back underneath the vocal fold. This is referred to as the vocal ligament. The outer 3 layers, the epithelium and the superficial and intermediate lamina propria, are relatively elastic and are referred to as the cover. The deepest 2 layers are relatively inelastic and referred to as the body. So depending on whether you're talking about different structural or functional aspects of what the vocal folds do, they can be divided up into a variety of different pieces that aren't necessarily distinct, that overlap with one another. The glottis is the space between the vocal folds. The size of that space is controlled by the movement of the arytenoids. This includes intrinsic laryngeal muscles such as the interarytenoid, the lateral cricoarytenoid, and the posterior cricoarytenoid. Movement of the vocal folds can vary from them being strongly adducted, so the glottis closed off very firmly so that air doesn't escape even under pressure, or they can be all the way strongly abducted, as in the lower right image, where there is much air space as possible to support something like heavy breathing during exercise, or the quick inhalation required to fill up the lungs for speech production. The vocal folds are less strongly adducted for speech, though they will be abducted for things like fricatives and stop consonant releases.